Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome back to the Grid Mod Pod. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Cook, and today I have the privilege of continuing a conversation with someone who's not only a colleague and a collaborator, but a friend, Dr. Katrina Kelly-Pitou. Hello, welcome back. In part one, this is part two, we really laid out a new way to talk about energy systems, possibly, not particular as wires and transformers, but reminding ourselves and maybe others, especially those listening, it's a living system shaped by politics, economics, and fundamentally trust. So we introduced the idea of seeds. It's kind of really where our origins became together. I guess she was my professor at one time. And from there, we really started to think about how can we create the story and understand the technical phenomena and tie the economics into really making smart electric energy districts, which is a powerful reframe, I think. aka one could say a microgrid designed to support the customer. And so with everything happening in our world today, especially around the extraordinary amount of data center load growth, the idea of microgrids may become maybe not the first thought, but I think, if we really think about it, it should be at the forefront of our conversation. We made a grid too big to fail. So how do we think about breaking it down and creating these grids to really serve pockets? So today we're going to go deeper. Is that the right word, Katrina? Really shift away from the what and maybe the why and really to the how. You take an idea like the seeds, which is in the middle of really this pragmatic energy landscape. So Katrina, why don't we share, kind of being in the trenches of it all, an opportunity where you're able to kind of bring these folks together and pencil it out and make it real. So
Yeah, no, I'd love to, and it's so fun to be back here and to get to talk about it. Like you said, I think we went over the macro, and next time I feel like we'll get to talk about really the micro details. But I think today is, like you said, the sandwich, which is like, okay, if all of the power paradigms are changing, what does it, in practicality, what does it look like to build a grid within a grid, and why would even one go about that, and what does it look like? And I think it's important for us to maybe even tee up. We are not talking about microgrid in a box. I think that's also something that we very early collaborated on. We came up through this sort of era of power engineering, I think, where everyone was like, the grid is failing, let's build a microgrid. And you don't have to rely on utilities. Maybe you do have to rely on utilities. And I actually think that for hardcore electrical engineering nerds right now, we're very firmly in the thought, as you said, the power grid is too big to fail. It's the physical manifestation of our financial system. Similarly, like if we don't let JP Morgan fail, we're definitely not going to let some of our big utilities fail because literally the lights will go out. So thinking about really what that complementary infrastructure that builds resilience into the system to keep the lights on. But I think also an important part of where we started conceptualizing seeds also comes from the notion of equity as well. One of the reasons I think that people forget to understand or talk about at times is the reason the grid is too big to fail too is because we have huge regulatory structures around it as well too. We have the common notion of what's fair from a rate case making. They are publicly regulated utilities at the same time, and there's a concept of fairness built in to the grid to keep it equitable and affordable. And I would say, if anything, that's maybe where the paradigm is having a failure right now, that technically we know the solutions. How one implements those and keeps those fair for the average customer in a way that's, safe, reliable, but fundamentally affordable is really the notion of where we landed on the smart electric energy districts. And I think we conceptualized that because we realized there was a problem with microgrid. It was a fully technical solution. How does one evolve the concept of technical development with equitable development and ground it into a thing? And for us, that was really, at its fundamental basis, sort of like a circuit by circuit level improvement of power resiliency, power sustainability, but also power affordability. So maybe we can kind of sort of talk through what those dimensions, like what does that even mean? It's still a lot
Right.
of jargon. What is a seed? How does this thing work? I think me and you have a lot of passion, and I mean, it took us a decade of collaborating together as, economic and electrical engineering professionals to really understand how that could be deployed.
Right. And just, maybe rehashing a little bit, but just from a, kind of a new light, you know, the formation of our connection and relationship was you were looking at this from an economics perspective,
Yep.
rooted in, the technical challenges of how to make it go. And then I was coming from really this power systems awareness of like what it would mean to integrate these new devices into a much larger system and the kind of the technical phenomena. And then
Mhm.
also at the time that we met, just getting acclimated to the dynamics of the utilities and how they operate internally, as well as what were the external drivers that more or less allowed them to pull the levers or not pull the levers. And so I would say I was walking in this naive space and like, oh, it's technology. Like you just, find the devices, connect them together like we always been and off we're running. And so, I always find you were a kind spirit where you like, oh, I've been in these rooms. It doesn't always come down to the technical capability or the easily formulated standards and specifications, which I say that lightly because those aren't easy.
No,
Once you get multiple personalities with multiple, not initiatives, what's the thing when you like motivations?
different drivers for motivation, definitely. Yep.
And then knowing the complexities of all of the approval processes and getting the various parts of the project aligned with the financials,
Mhm.
it becomes a very difficult job. So, you know, you and I have kind of been off running in different spaces, but really in the same space. And you have effectively, you know, found some key players. I think the players that we were working with originally, we could not pencil out or communicate effectively to those parties, but we were not wrong. They were not ready and or had the desire to really lean in and think of this bigger picture. So, you know, with some of these projects that you're actively pursuing and doing, what made it work, what maybe nearly broke it. So there's probably those moments. And then again, that momentum that able to keep it churning. And you kind of mentioned it, but
Yeah, no, I think to your point, the people dynamic and having the person who's going to be the change maker in these systems conversations is the fundamentally most important aspect of all of it. I think something that we realized when asking the question, how does one, I mean, fundamentally too, I think we're tiptoeing around the fact that you were at a regulated utility. What was exciting though is you are in distribution, but you guys were also getting a lot of gruff from the community that was like, you guys must decarbonize with us. And it was like, we kind of pass through the electrons, like we're not even allowed to generate them. But fundamentally, which is I think really lucky for us being in the city we were, is it's was a company and still is a company that people really talk about with pride, that they do care about the community and the utility, and especially you being in the utility and you being you who, cares about energy and people and health and community so passionately and deeply. I want to underscore that like you were that person in the utility, and having you there to push the button and be the champion of change each and every day was the number one reason we had success there. It was like you cared to be the champion of change. And that's the biggest factor. And I do say perhaps without bias, the most often client that I have who's making change, it's very often a woman at the table who's wanting to do it, which is very fun, but also very different, I think, for, electrical engineering. So that being said,
thank you.
it is. No, it's true. It's so you, and it's still so important being that change maker and pushing for it and helping people understand that they can be changed is also something that I think we underestimate, because for anybody who was a distributor, you're legally not allowed to help. And if you care about pollution, you have kids and stuff, everybody hopefully wants to be a good person and make that change. So that was our notion, right? We started with a concept. What can we do? You guys couldn't change, your generation sources in totality, but you were allowed to work with the concept of resiliency. And the thing that you were mandated to do, right, was keep affordability. You had to like explain rate case making and all of that. So I think when we started to work together, that's like, I always say I'm obsessed with the notion of power structures, both in their kind of physical but theoretical concept of being, the physical, okay, here's where your power and electricity comes from. But we always go back to that standpoint that it's the construction of power management around that. How does the government making work around that? What's the power paradigm, if you will, the metaphysical space that the power paradigm lies within? To me, that's fascinating. And so I asked the question, like, how, I don't know if either one of us embraced it at that moment. We're both doing, I was a professor, you were a PhD, so I think maybe we underestimated our curiosity.
Well, I would have to say, I mean, like hindsight is 2020, but when I look back on, a lot of the rooms or the conversations or the ideas that I've generated, that curiosity and that desire to ask why,
Yeah.
but why, but why, and then have the gumption to go talk with everyone that I was pointed towards, and starting to feel like maybe just no one had the answer or no one wanted to answer it. And so that in itself is human behavior. It's not their job, or they don't have the authority, or they're not being held accountable. So then it became very like this pragmatic, like, why am I short on words? Ping pong.
Oh
What am I
yeah, but
pronouncing?
well, the word I was going to use was like a European soccer reference. It was a bit of a tiki-taka going back and forth.
And then fundamentally, like, I had these moments where, like, wait, maybe I'm the answer, or maybe
Uh-huh.
I create it, or maybe I draft it, and bring in, the folk to review it, agree with it, drive it, support it. And you're not really taught that, right? And so how can we expedite some of that, especially with the next generation and really the workforce, is like,
Yeah.
ideas come from creative thoughts, right? Like
Yeah.
they're almost magical. And then how do you ground them and then drive them? And even if they don't succeed, all of that effort, there's so much learnings from it. Anyway.
And I think the number one important thing that you said is how do you ground it and drive it? I think the first thing, and maybe that's even where we start explaining why did we say seed? The one thing that we started with is we realized there was like jargon everywhere. The definition of what we wanted to achieve like trips up people. And like we love IEEE standards. To your point, they're so important. But we realized people were getting tripped up by saying, okay, you guys want to create a microgrid. What is a microgrid? Okay, it's localized direct current, essentially distribution installations. And then people would be like, well, like, can it island itself? Are you islanding for how much of the time? What does it mean? And we were like, okay, we don't even know if we're island. We want to have that capabilities to island, sure. But like what we actually are talking about when we actually step back and said, what are we bloody talking about in these things? We're like, what we're talking about is updating and modernizing our grid, keeping the rates low, getting new developers to tell us when they're actually building stuff on the grid, right? And actually, offering a solution, being a partner and installing clean technologies because you're not legally allowed to, right? So
Right.
actually, when we pulled back the curtain, we were like, some of this actually is technical for sure. We want to make sure that people, but a bunch of it was actually more stakeholder and management. It's like how does a utility get a social license to operate, if you will, within a community? How does a community become a player in developing the cities of the future? And how does a utility become like the centering force for development? That's what the seed concept became about. It's
Right.
that grounding development for how a utility cooperates with a developer and cooperates with a community to create a node of change. Full stop.
I mean, another, it wasn't that we sought out some of the main takeaways, but really allowing the utility who has really in the middle of all of this dynamic transformational change outside that doesn't have the levers to exactly pull based on some of the things you just said.
Yeah.
But coming back to the table as the local community energy advisor, like becoming experts in enabling this new way of thinking, of doing, of technology, of innovation, and so like just kind of pivoting, like we'll figure this out together. the learnings that we gain from all of the diverse interactions and really the technology that ultimately gets implemented, learnings will occur, and then we'll be better prepared for the next one. And everyone saw it as one and done instead of this really thematic, over-encompassing idea. And so when we talked about seeds, it was like we wanted it to be community resiliency hubs. And then we would get stuck in wormholes about like, well, what is resiliency and who gets it first and why do they get it and how are you prioritizing them? And then it was like, well, it's resiliency and additional reliability. And it's like, well, why reliability here? So like every time you like rephrased or repackaged, I think I became or started to desire to become a communication expert. I think I'm still working on it. But the powers of play really pulled us all different ways. But in the end, the idea between the seeds is like you have a community. And I think a fundamental misunderstanding is the transmission to distribution grid, that we have distribution grids modeled in a way that are circuit by circuit, but the circuits are very, especially in like higher population or like more population, they're integrated, they're intertwined, they're interlocked. So it's almost a mesh network in itself designed over time. Yeah. So all that to say, it's like you can create pockets within pockets and then isolate parts of your circuits, which then increases the reliability in that. And then you scale it. But like, it's really hard to get that started because it's kind of that whole initial condition phenomena of like, well, where do you start and why start there? Yeah. And getting over that hurdle. So you have effectively done that in some spots, right? Like,
yeah. But I think where you have, and I want to even pause there too, because you actually said something, not to go down like a super nerdy tangent hole, but to go down. I think what we stumbled on that we underemphasize sometimes is you use the word mesh network. And that's really exciting actually, because I think what we both came up in the time of is realizing is that electrical engineering was happening here. Kind of the economics of the grid was happening here. And it was a combination of how you reconcile these things together. And simply by looking together, right? An economist, as you evaluate a city, you kind of go through GIS, you see a bunch of data, etc. I never saw utility circuits, right? Getting to work with you, I was like, oh, you also are using GIS over here and you have all the circuits and stuff. And then when you put them all together and you look, into your point, we were like, it's super messy. And then actually, like, physically, when you look at all of that stuff, it is mesh networks. And the most exciting thing about that, though, is like now we have computer science in the middle of it, where it's like networks, amazing. That's how you analyze telecommunications. We can use network theory to analyze and optimize these systems. And to your point, as long as we start with one node, and we understand how one node works as part of the longer system, it's literally how people understand brain activity. I think you and I were just like, this is actually something that's super common, but it's not in either one of our subjects. But I think that's where we both leaned into starting to other disciplines, fundamentally talking to computer scientists about how they would update and analyze telecommunications network to learn how to apply that really, honestly, fundamentally data-driven machine learning aspects of analysis and just apply it to the electric grid. And we just, like, I am proud, we're kind of the first, I think, generation of EE people that came up and were like, we don't know how to do this, but you know who knows how to do this? Those guys in the School of Computer Science and Information.
Like, we'll go there. I don't know why I have to share this story, but initial condition has come up in my conversations quite a bit in the last. And so what does that mean? Like, and I don't know if anyone has ever tried, and probably not many, have had to deal with long hair that gets matted with young children. Or let's just go with a ball of string. Yes. You have to choose a moment or like an area, and you start pulling it out. And I think the hardest part of like getting over that hump, because of that initial start, like you don't know your costs, you don't know your timeline, you don't know the expertise or the talent that's going to be needed, right? Like when you're pulling apart that mat, you don't know how large of a mess this may become.
Well, to your point, it's like gum within a hair, right? Where it's like, once you start getting in and digging it, it like gets messier. Then if you pull one, that's how the circuit works. Like you pull one bad circuit and overload it, you're like, oh shit, I didn't know that it was actually all the way over here connected to this node. And by the way, back in the day, they then put this type of, I don't know, industrialization over there and did another corridor connection just because this guy's cousin actually worked at the train company and he delivered him steel in 1856. And you're like, wait,
And
we
then,
didn't have electricity then? What? It's like, it was 1856 was an exaggeration, by the way, for my real
well,
parents, but
trains were there, but like there's some power source there. But like when you think about that, that pulling apart and that analyzing, like what at the core of it, who's pulling it? Maybe a mother, someone that you're trusting your hair with. Like there's a trust
yeah.
part there. Like we have to allow, and the only ones that can start pulling those threads is really the utilities. But we're in this, but then, so utilities are slow to move. So like, how do we break that free that allows them to like, well, we'll go do this. And then here comes developers, like, yes, right, let's go.
Well,
I think
developers,
that
like, let's put another chunk of gum in your hair. But to your point, a material scientist would come in and say, let's freeze that gum and then it'll remove it. And you're like, okay, let's do that. So I think that's what we figured out is actually how do you freeze the gum?
how do you freeze the gum?
Where do you do that? And I think that's where, for us, what we did a good job of analyzing is where it made sense to start pulling. Where was it the messiest? Where were loads the heaviest? And so we did start from a technical standpoint of like physically the grid, is about to be stressed here. And so if we have a bunch of new high rises that are going to get put on there, you asked me the question because, I work for an architecture essentially. What does it mean when all these buildings come on? And when I told you the estimated load profiles of those buildings, your question then was like, yeah, but can't you make them better? And I was like, "Pfft, I could cut that in 50%. I could make them like, if you gave me enough roof space on them, I could help them generate solar and stuff." And so actually we started from a design perspective and then actually where we fell down, which is where we've gotten over today. And to your point is we were like, oh, we can super figure out how to do this. We even got everyone on the same page, which was probably largely because we had spent so much time with these people, over a decade in Pittsburgh. It came down to a simple thing of nobody wanted to pay for it. Everybody wanted a sustainable building that interacted with the grid, that provided, on-site generation and batteries that could feed back. Duquesne Light was like, great, we can work with this. It's amazing. And then we all came to the table. There was like this big conference, and everyone was like, that's amazing. Who's paying for it? Crickets. And then like 3 weeks later, it was like, this shall not happen because who is going to pay for it? And so then we found two
Question we're all
options.
dealing with, right?
Yeah, and we found two options, which is there's three options actually for payment, right? Who pays for infrastructure and upgrades? Either you pass it off in rate making, it goes, becomes part of, you go from 6.7 kilowatt cents an hour to 7.1 cents per kilowatt hour, but you've proved it's by public good. Quite hard to do, right? For one node. So there's that. You explore that avenue, but you can only do this much upgrade. When you then say, okay, but developer, you need to make your building better, that's the developer. There's nobody else who's going to pay for that. That's a private investment. So you need a developer who's working to pay for the cost of upfront infrastructure development. Because to your point, then what we learned is like there's not really private equity firms out there interested in investing in grid modernization, in financing infrastructure that is on a smaller scale basis. And I think that's maybe important for utilities overall, or maybe people know it, but the world of project financing exists all over the place. How you finance a bridge, how you publicly finance big infrastructure projects. It's arguably, some of the first financing that we'd ever done in the universe, right? Like funding big projects is fine because you make a lot of money back, but it takes sort of 20-year minimum to make that money back.
Right. Like if your project's less than like 10 million, no one wants to. It's the same amount of paperwork for 100 million. So
Yeah, people
you
don't
really
care.
get passed over. There's not a whole lot of people that are out there willing to take that risk and put that endurance behind it.
And I think it's a simple thing is like finance people didn't care, right? We were like, we need money for higher performing building systems. We need money for rooftop solar and we need money for batteries and we need money for a centralized microgrid controller. And they were like, how much does this cost? To your point, we're like 10 million. People were like, make that guy pay. He's got 10 million, from so and so's brother. And you're like, but he doesn't want to pay because he's a developer and he has like, I don't know, all these
Razor
capital
thin
stacks.
margins.
Yeah, and we're like, okay, stuff falls down. So to your point, you need a person who's going to push it and be a champion of it. You need an idea of what you're trying to achieve. For us, the Smart Electric Energy District was that, right? On-site generation, microgrid control, really like a survey of existing infrastructure and upgrades, and actually then the incentive to build a high-performing building system on it. And we lacked it. So at the end of the day, I think what we actually ended up coming up with, that maybe we haven't, put the nail into what it actually was. It really is a very firm concept of public-private partnerships that go beyond a normal PPA for solar and attach the distribution, right? It's like the next version of a PPA for solar. We sort of developed the notion of a PPA for a microgrid installation, if you will. And we didn't get the funding for it because that's where, to your point, that's where it fell down, is like, how does this pencil out? How's the financing work? And to your point even further, it has worked in other parts of the country, I've found out, and it all comes down all day, every day to the economics around it.
Right. So like all day, every day, we do talk about the lack of, resources, workforce, supply chain capabilities. But like those are all hurdles. But unless you have someone showing up at the door with the dollars ready to invest in the concept, but knowing you're taking on those variables, you're going to have a hard time.
Or you have the ROI, to your point, like demonstrating the return on investment of the project. That's been our big workaround. A lot of people, if they don't have the upfront cash, they will be interested in the ROI. What's hard for us here in Pennsylvania has always been our fees are so low on utilities. As a company, we've had the most success on microgrids. And don't get me wrong, we haven't built 10, but we have built, a handful of them, and they're all in California. And it's because they have the time of day energy rates. And it's because they have really, honestly, it's the demand surcharges that happen so often in really times of fire or times of heat, high heat in the summertime in California. Their peak prices get so high that if you can tell a developer, like, it's going to be 6 years for your ROI and you're going to avoid those, like, at least they can then plan in the financing around that. The unplanned pricing surcharges in California have definitely been some of the biggest drivers for microgrids. That's not anybody new for your audience, but it's just to say, like, for those of us interested in microgrids, or even in, the concept of distribution resiliency as an investment, that
in the current space, those are the things that kind of the dominoes that fell that allowed them to move forward. So the awareness that, that kind of perfect storm had to exist. But I think, from the workings and executing the projects and implementing them, there's many more positive gains that we're not applying to our stacks originally to like move projects forward in other areas. Would you say? Right.
And it's honestly like risk analysis. It's honestly like a risk analysis of infrastructure that really, I think, defined the projects that we got to work on. Just being able to talk to a developer and say, like, how much are you going to pay for your utility interconnection? Like, how much are you going to pay for your feeder extension that's happening here? And then sitting down with the utility and asking them what the lead time was that in reality, and then having that sink down, and then have them talk about, how they were going to facilitate development happening. Outside of California, the biggest driver, to go back to the people perspective of microgrids, have been people thinking that utilities are not easy to work with. And it's not even a financial necessarily number you can put a number on. It's developers who are used to doing quick transactions, who are used to building stuff, getting stuff done, and being able to walk away. Utilities we came up, I think, both in this era, and hopefully it resonates with some people, where, working at a utility was called a country club job, right? You got to go in, you got to have a good time. And that era ended when we came, because it was like the grid is falling. It was like fear mongering era, right?
I wasn't a part of that. What?
We're not that old. Like, let's not age ourselves.
And what that meant is, like, thinking about the history of the grid, there was an enormous amount of innovation and standardization and build out over the first like 50, 60 years. And then once
there's just an era there, by the way, because like what year that was? It's like in the early 1900s.
Let's say like 1920s to like 1980s.
Just to be clear, it wasn't like the 80s.
Right. And then what happened in the 1980s, maybe even a little earlier, is that the infrastructure was so robust, and we did not have the capability, capacity, or really the visionary, some people did, that we're going to continue to be able to use more and more energy.
Mhm.
So we tapped out, and then really in the 90s, right, the whole phenomenon was like, wait a second, if we keep going at this rate and we built this huge massive machine that had somewhat of this reserve, it's going to get eat up. And then, it was like a 10, 20, 30 year. And so it wasn't like the alarm bells weren't spinning, but we went into a observation and observe the grid, and it runs smoothly, one-way power flow. We know where our assets are. We understand the mechanics of them. Not a whole lot of novel thought. So the country club job perspective was, you had your series of assets, you kind of had your predictable load growth, you had your financial models, and you kind of went in and you executed on the maintenance. And so then I think it was really, 2000, and there was a lot of loss in new talent between the 1990s and 2010 in the utility industry, where there was no hiring and a lot of universities dropped their power programs. And so any desire for new ways of embracing the next generation workforce maybe wasn't looked at. I'm not sure. But then now you have this whole aged workforce with this brand new, like, bushy tail and shiny, bright, thoughts like, oh, we can do things differently. And everyone's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Yeah. So be careful on that change. And by the way, we put an enormous amount of standardization, regulatory, and compliance in our way and permitting. So it's not like we can flip a switch and start becoming this innovative, novel organization like we once were in the 20s and beyond. So I mean, that's kind of what you and I walked in our space. And so I think we've been there ever since. And now that 2030, 40-year forecast from the 80s is now we're like 1, 2, 5, 7 years. And then here comes the data center growth. And we're all in this position of how do we launch and not kill bold ideas, right? And how do we execute on them? And so, from your perspective, one of your projects that California had the right pieces, but what are some of the learnings once you got started, the funding was there, what were the next hurdles, and or then what were some of the things that you were able to champion and see through?
Well, that's a threefold question. I was like, "Ooh, those are big ones to remember."
So take a particular project, knowing that, yes, the funding showed up based on some unique pricing and regulatory environments. So then you were a go. Like, the next series of challenges.
Yeah, I think the biggest go, I'm trying not to be like a super policy person about it, but actually it is, the biggest go is having a clear policy framework to operate around. I think that's what's hard is some people think that regulation is penalizing, if you will, a punitive structure. And actually, I think in my personal experience, regulation has it's actually kind of clear boundaries it defines the rules of a game, if you will. And if you think about that from an economic perspective, rules of the game are amazing because then you can do quite good predictability. And I think to your point, maybe it's my like economic bias. I always come back to having rules of the game lets you know how to win the game. But I think having those clear roles from the government at the end of the day, how you play with a grid as a developer, it is a game. You both have different kind of ambitions, but you have to understand and define a mutual goal to win. And to me, defining the mutual goal to win has been really easy whenever you have clear signals from the government saying our goal is decarbonization. Number one, our goal is affordability of rates for our community. And we have decided that the ownership and empowerment of these structures comes from a city entity or a cooperative entity. I have not, in California, it's also been, I'm a utility. I want to own and play in the game, and we've had that. But most often, I hate to say, the success of the game has been clearly defined people saying, I do not want to solely rely on my utility. I want to be the person who is in control of my own destiny, and I'm willing to pay to have that control. And as an example, a recent microgrid project, that we just finished the analysis of that we're going to start shoveling even through, we've been working on for about 4 years at SmithGroup. The estimated rates of, it's a university that's going to almost double in size over the next 10 years to feed the load growth in the area of California it's in. The utility estimated it was going to be, somewhere over $40 million in infrastructure upgrades for them, within kind of, they were like, well, maybe we can do it within this cycle, but transmission delays, workforce delays, all this stuff happening. To do this, it's going to cost XYZ. We'll use 40 million as an example. When we priced out how they could create a learning program of kind of evolving electrical engineering back into power systems engineering, how they could use their own power systems professors to help manage assets, use their facility managers, work with PPA structures around solar and batteries, because now solar companies are offering those batteries, and then simply pay for the extension themselves. They're universities, so they've managed, their distribution. The price tag came down to under 30 million. So they were like, no brainer. And the utility was like, well, you're responsible if any of this stuff breaks. And they were like, that's a $10 million gamble we're willing to take. We did that for them. And a lot of it came down to we didn't have to do as many substation extensions as we needed to from relying on that concept. But that's, I think, an example of the rules of the game were there, right? Like in California, you're allowed to build microgrids. So it already was like, are we allowed? Yes, let's do it. Has someone done it before? Yeah, what did it look like? And there's three kind of layers that lead into it, really. And I've mentioned them before, but time of day energy rates are really probably the clearest signal you can have that electricity is a scarcity and should be managed as such. And that time of day pricing, I think, is probably the clearest mechanism you can have, as well as the clear mechanism that community and ownership is encouraged. And both of those things have been really, I think, the two most critical factors to success in the build out of microgrids, at least my own personal limited experience.
I don't know if I'm going to open a can of worms here, but yeah.
Crack that open.
Well, and it's a conversation that stuck with me where, I was speaking with someone, family friend, and, being asked about the power grid has become a reality of mine at picnics in the last 5 years. I would say not in the first
picnics you're going towards.
Oh, everyone wants to know about the power grid. Is it going to be around? Is it going to be survive? Like, what's happening with it? And so there's this like general theme that was occurring between like the three gentlemen that I was standing around, that the idea of the utility having any oversight of the energy they use and the ability to like turn them off was like, I felt a sense of energy of like anger. And I just like, wait a second. Can I just remind you, like right now, the grid as it is today, if there is a tree and or a critter and or a motor vehicle accident and or a piece of equipment that may fail, the utility, which you want them to have, has the capability to isolate and eliminate any danger from said service point, which means you. So the utility already can push a button with the remote control that they've all have, gained over the last 30 years. And the looks on their face were so unaware. And so the more I think about like time of use rates, like somehow we've used language that became a space where we latch onto a negative realm, but like just spinning the words in a way that brings a positive light of why would we not want the capability to have kind of an awareness of our energy use that's almost automated for us in a way that serves us, which we kind of have from a circuit, maybe low block level, but when we get down to the end use case, those are what time of use rates can ultimately do, is provide signals to the human to behave a certain way.
Yeah.
And it's a positive direction. Why do we have to latch on to this negative connotation? I'm not saying everyone does, but I have a general feel that like time of use rates, there's a whole lot of roots that are entangled, kind of like that, to get those through.
No, behavior is really the word for it too, because I also, I have a European family, and whenever my French family comes to visit, they even think California's rates aren't that expensive. Like in France, you pay like 36 cents a kilowatt hour at times for time of day. There's this fundamental entitlement that we've gone through in the States, that everything is free and I deserve to be able to use as much as I want when I want, and how that I think is a bit of an issue. I'm like essentially an environmental conservationist at the core of everything that I do, though. So perhaps, I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder at the moment, which is, my cognitive bias to deal with. But to me as well, too, like I don't fundamentally believe, or nor do I champion the notion of, just unlimited energy sources, if you will. And to take it back to your perspective too, like we've lost the plot there, I think, as utility professionals too. Like the cleanest energy, to make it non-political whatsoever, is that's what's reused, right? So I think that's like something for people to really maybe start embracing, is like a lot of reasons that utility nerds get excited about the concept of solar and batteries isn't just because they're clean and, we're super liberal about it. By the way, they are clean, and we're also cautious about batteries. But I think the number one reason that we get most interested in it is because it's energy conservation at its core. It's already created, then you get to reuse it. It's why I love nuclear in France. We do subgeological disposal of our nuclear fuel rods and then reuse them again. It's like a continual cycle.
Right.
So I think that cyclical manner, as you get to, if you will, is something that, from a value perspective and maybe how we live our lives in Americans, to me, it manifests itself in our usage of resources. We don't believe in the concept of like limiting ourselves. There's like this hedonistic, like I'm gonna get all of it. And to me, I know it's like dramatic and ridiculous, but I think
I didn't
I
say
don't know how you break that for electrical consumption, but like it's like our American values to me consistently show up and are represented the most almost in how we treat utilities. And it's like a little bit unfair, I feel like. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, maybe our listeners are hearing too over and over, is in these projects or these concepts, when they succeed and or do not, it doesn't ultimately come down to infrastructure.
Very
So
rarely does.
it's really the relationship architecture and having adaptive leadership and mindset to really define the next step, right? Like redefining who gets to be in the room, are you reserving, and quite frankly, like rethinking the structures that we sit in. And so successes really highlight some of those opportunities to then scale or reuse for a future project, and kind of it's a ripple effect.
Yep.
So I'm going to tee you up on one last question with the time we have. Can the seeds model per se scale across cities and regions, maybe even nationally? Like, from your perspective.
We have a grid of
Do you believe
microgrids,
in
if
it?
you will?
Yes.
I believe in it, but I will say, as you said, to close it up, at the end of the day, I'm a bit of a like policy wonk for hire, if you will, right? I'm an economist. I always say, like, it's a game. So you can either hire us to help you be a partner with utilities and kind of win the game together, or what we're finding over and over is developers are hiring us and their ambition is make my electricity bills as small as possible. And for me, how I construct prices, I can construct and financially engineer how you use energy with controllers now, just like you can construct, the wires that flow into them. So I kind of say now, like, maybe I get sad because I feel like economists are only kind of used at like the market level, but I say like they can be used at the technical level for evil or for good. So it's like, how do you want to play in the game? We'll figure it out. But like it's the most fun one ever to figure out. We can either do it for good or for bad. We believe in doing it for good.
Yeah. So you believe in it. So
We
I
believe
say
in it.
that's a wrap for part 2, because, one, thank you, Katrina, for your clarity, your realness, and truly your commitment to turning big ideas into this grounded action, knowing we're here for the long haul. And so
Absolutely.
I think what'll be really powerful is, maybe a part 3 where we can bring on an actual developer that has kind of been there through the interconnection timeline talk, through the local politics, through the cost curves, and kept the project alive, right? And making it happen. So I look forward to that conversation and keeping this moving forward.
She will be another interesting female voice to bring into this discussion, because as you said, it's definitely one where it's cool to see how someone who has the bank account, from a financing perspective, from a private perspective, it's not on personal money, has the ambition though to do change for good in a community that she cares and lives in, puts the effort in. It's another example of that being the driving recipe for successful change. So I look forward to the discussion. I think it's going to be it's going to be like the perfect trifecta of discussion, right? Kind of like the I don't know, I guess the consultant perspective, but with the utility perspective, with the developer perspective, it's going to be real-time grid therapy. So I'm looking forward to it.
So stay with us, listeners. Subscribe if you haven't, and really keep building and leaning into what truly matters.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Cook.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.